Hello, friends. Welcome to the Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is Ryder 2025 Freight Insights with my friend Kendra Phillips. How's it going, Kendra?
Hi, Joe. It's going well. How are you doing?
Doing great. Good to talk to you again. We were blabbing offline, but now it's official talking to you. So, Kendra, please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
Absolutely. I'm Kendra Phillips. I'm the VP of Transportation Management and Brokerage at Ryder System. I'm calling from Miami, Florida, which is Ryder's headquarters. And for those of you who don't know Ryder, Ryder is a supply chain logistics company. So we do warehousing, we do transportation management, we do brokerage, and we also have the fleet side of our house where most people know us for, where you can rent and maintain and lease commercial vehicles.
Whoa. Say that all one slower this time with a little more detail, if you don't mind. So I might have a question in between.
Absolutely. So we do warehousing, transportation management, dedicated management, brokerage and then we also have our fleet side of the house where you can lease and maintain and rent commercial vehicles, commercial trucks.
So there's a lot of companies that in this business that they're probably saying, yeah, I lease my trucks from Ryder already, so I know them from that.
Yes. That's how most companies know us. A lot don't think of us as a supply chain company, but we're actually a leader in the market, both on the warehousing, transportation, and actually the dedicated side as well.
I told you this before, and I think anyone who's in the Detroit metro area in automotive, like I passed, I was positive that Ryder was a Detroit company because they had all of the automotive business. And I know you have still a very big footprint, but you've grown in other industries, but Ryder was the big dog and probably still is in automotive.
That's how we got our bearings in supply chain. You're absolutely correct. That's our history. It's our longest service outside of the truck leasing and rental and maintenance. It's the automotive industry. And you're also correct. We have a huge facility up in Novi. It's one of our homes away from home for sure.
Yeah, I'm supposed to go meet Gary Allen over there because I see him at Manifest every year. And he said, let's have lunch. We live 15 minutes away from each other, but I'm not too far from Novi and even closer to his house. But anyway, what parts are you responsible for within Ryder?
I run transportation management and brokerage. I always say it's anything that's not running on a Ryder asset or in a Ryder warehouse. We tend to manage the entire transportation network for most of our Fortune 300 customers. And when I say entire transportation network, that's usually US or North America based. So any goods that they're moving will come through us. We'll manage that on their behalf, procuring the carriers for them, negotiating the rates, managing the different market conditions. We'll actually manage the day-to-day operations. So making sure that the carriers show up on time, leave on time. If there's issues, deal with those issues, make sure everything gets delivered when expected. We're going to do all of the carrier payables and customer invoicing. We'll audit all of the carrier invoices for them as well. And then I think the most important and valuable part is we take all of that to create our data analytics and our business intelligence and use that for continuous improvement with the customers. So where do they have opportunities to lower their costs by potentially making some of the changes in their network or in their day-to-day operations? So that's something we're really focused on with our customers. That's the heart and soul of our transportation management offering. And then we also have our brokerage arm, which I think you're aware we recently acquired Cardinal Logistics. And so brokerage was one of their offerings. So between their brokerage and ours coming together now, we are now our top 50 broker, which is something we're really proud of and allows us to offer more flexibility to our customers, especially our transportation management customers. So it's a really nice addition and growth of our service offering.
Yep, Kendra, when I first came to this space, I was from an automotive guy, which I always say it's the biggest, baddest supply chain on earth. So I thought I knew something. And when I came to the space, I was at a 3PL, and I came to the conclusion over a few years that as the internet and all the technology companies that allow you to match loads and all that became better and better, we would have less brokered freight. And I even said it, I don't know which podcast, but I've said it on my podcast that I think over time we won't need as many freight brokers because And I'm not one of those people who says, "You're just a middleman," 'cause you don't get to be the middleman unless you add value in the middle. But m m b from what I'm seeing and there's not a ton of data on this, but from what I'm seeing and hearing, a larger percentage of freight is brokered now than 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
Why
And
is that?
yes, it's a significant difference, by the way. On average, customers or shippers, about 30% of their freight today is brokered. You would not have seen anywhere near that number 10 years ago, to your point. So you are dead on. I have my personal theories on why, and they're all really good.
Well, that's what I wanna hear.
Yeah, one thing for sure is I think the boom of the ELDs and technology in the truck, right? 10 years ago, that didn't exist, and that was a huge hindrance to brokering because traditionally brokers go to smaller carriers, and if smaller carriers don't have any tech in their truck, they used to not, then you couldn't track them. And if you're not tracking your carrier, you don't know if they're arriving on time, you don't know where your product is, and it's hard to figure out if your product got delivered on time. And so since the LD mandate came into play, it really leveled the playing field. A small carrier has just as much technology in their truck as a large carrier does. And it really allowed the small carriers to have a service level that is much closer to on par with the large carriers. And I think that made a huge difference in brokerage and enabling those small carriers to have a bigger piece of shippers' pie, which again usually tends to go through brokerage. The other side of that, I would argue, actually, I think there's two more. One is brokers in general also got more tech savvy, right? It used to be solely about working the phone, still is. It's not that it isn't. But as you have that technology, it also allows you as a broker, that middleman, to offer more value that you were talking about, right? So you have the small trucker offering more value, the broker offering more value. And then I think the third part that it will be interesting to see how it plays out over the next couple of years, but obviously spot rates have been much lower than contract rates for the past 2.5 years. Spot rates lower tend to favor brokers. So more freight's been going to brokers because of that. As the market dynamics start to change, it'll be interesting to see what percentage of brokered freight is in a shipper's portfolio. I don't have a prediction on that, but I would expect it to go down. To be honest, does it go down to 20%? I don't know. Does it go to 28%? Who knows where it goes to? But on average today, it's sitting around 30%.
Yeah, I think those 3 points are good ones. I've always thought that you'd see the no need for the technology that I thought the trucking companies would have that same technology, but the trucking companies, I think, say, "We're gonna buy trucks," the ultimate technology, by the way, "and we're gonna buy all that tech stack that goes in the truck." I know I got I told you before we hit record that talking to Jack Kennedy from Platform Science, and when I called it an ELD, he said, "It's so much more than an ELD." I said, "I don't know what to call it, but it's a tech stack within the truck." So those are the investments they wanna make, and I can see the largest companies are gonna say, "Yes, we can afford all the investments." But if I owned a trucking company, I'd be very tempted to say, "I'm just going to focus on trucking. I don't wanna buy all the stuff that the brokers I work with have." And by the way, I get phone calls from little carriers all the time say, this is exactly the word they say, "I just want good shipper freight." And I said, "I know what you're saying. You don't wanna work with a broker." And they say, "Yes, because 'cause they're making all the money." And in a down market like we've been in, I think some brokers are under the impression that I'm just getting by and this broker's killing it. But I think the reality is both are making less money than in an up market.
I agree. And I think that's proven by we've seen brokers go out of business, right?
Right.
And we've seen some consolidation in the space. So I think you're absolutely correct. In a down market, unfortunately, no one's making much money on transportation right now. But it is hurting. I do think it's hurting the small trucking companies the most because on the flip side, the cost of running a truck continues to go up every day, regardless of even the technology sitting in it. Just cost of operating a truck is constantly going up, and that's not going to change. So it becomes harder and it causes transportation costs to go up.
So I always say to those little trucking companies, you have a choice. You can either go spend on a sales force, get your website up and running, get a marketing team, or you can find a good broker to work with because the best brokers are godsend to carriers. And I think not all brokers are created equal. By the way, one last thing before we leave this topic. I feel like shippers have recognized the value that brokers bring a lot more in that last 10 years. Because I think brokers have focused on those investments, not only in the technology, but also in customer success teams, which by the way, first time I heard somebody say customer success or customer experience, I was like, oh, come on. Now I'm thinking, oh, that's exactly what people want. I want that. And we have a meeting this morning with my team because the customer experience always has to be upgraded. And I think brokers have done a fantastic job over the last decade of really upping their game. So when you get a call from a broker and they used to say, if you're a broker, hey, I'd like to talk about your freight. And they go, do you have trucks? Nope. Click. That doesn't happen as much anymore.
And the brokers have two sets of customers in my mind, right? One's the shipper, that their actual customer, but they have to treat carriers like customers. They have to, even in today's market, right? And what you said is important. A good broker is going to understand the carrier and their profile and what type of freight meets their needs and enables them to be profitable so they can stay in business. A good broker plays a very important role in the mix. I agree
Right.
with you.
I always heard going back a decade, people would say, we're developing a carrier network over here. And I remember the first time I walked through a brokerage, good sized one, and they said, and all these guys are in carrier sales. And I didn't ask, but my thought was, oh, you're also in another business where you're selling carriers.
Well, it's true. I have an entire carrier sales team in my org, so you are absolutely correct. But they're selling to carriers. It's
Yeah.
true. It's
Anyway, Kendra, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you joined the mothership Ryder.
absolutely. I grew up in Orlando, Florida, so I am a Florida woman through and through. I went to Vanderbilt University undergrad, so I'm a left-brained engineering geek. So I did chemical engineering and math. That was my focus. And then I ended up getting an MBA at Kellogg at Northwestern.
Wow, those are fancy schools.
Those are my schools. My career highlight, I have been a writer for almost 18 years, so it's most of my career highlight. It's been an incredible journey. But prior to Ryder, I came out of undergrad and worked at Deloitte Consulting. And I think spending my early first career in consulting, honestly, it's probably one of the best ways you can enter the workforce. The rate you learn that about the real world and business, I don't know where else you get that kind of exposure. So I think I was very fortunate to come out and have that opportunity to work at Deloitte. And then obviously, I feel extremely fortunate to have been at Ryder this long.
Very nice, very nice. Before we hit the record button today, we talked about a few things, and we're going to talk about 2025. But first and foremost, let's talk about, maybe you could look back a little bit. So let's take us back to the COVID time. During COVID, things boomed. We were all delighted. We thought these times will never end. Money was cheap. VCs were swarming around the industry, and we had very low interest rates. The world was a beautiful place other than COVID. But since then, we've had a little bit of a freight recession. Talk about what caused that and then what you're seeing today.
Yes, I think anyone who's spent a lot of their life in the transportation industry is used to the cycles.
The boom bust.
Absolutely. And we've been spending a lot of time at Ryder talking about how can we help not make it like this, but maybe make it a little bit more, instead of a mountain, make it a hill, right?
Smoothed it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a really tough conversation. I think anyone who's been here a long time has gone through a lot of that. And I say that because COVID was probably the ultimate, right? I've lived through a lot of freight cycles. I've seen the good, I've seen the bad, but what happened in COVID, and it's the same thing that happens everywhere else. It was every other time, but it was so magnified with COVID. And we were talking a bit about this. So sorry, I'm going to back up. We had the ELD mandate go into effect. And what happened when that occurred
Is that 2019 or so?
I was going to say 18, but
Could be. Yep. Okay.
maybe it was 17, even though my memory is fuzzy. But a lot of carriers left the market. So we actually have a graph that shows carriers entering ELD mandate. We just tanked.
Because they didn't wanna make that little investment.
They didn't want to make that investment, or if they made it, they couldn't be profitable, whatever it may have been. And so the number of carriers that left, at least in the time period that we have data for, was more significant than we'd ever seen. And then a few years later, COVID hits, and obviously, I think with the number one of the, I shouldn't say the number one, a large challenge in the US was transporting product, right? Getting product from A to B, getting it through supply chains and getting it to end consumers. And so trucking became such a necessity for all of us. And so when that happened, trucking prices skyrocketed and it became very economical to become a truck driver or to have a carrier. And so you suddenly saw what had been going like this, went down because of the LD, suddenly it started going up again. So this many truckers are entering the market. And it actually surpassed any of the levels we've been at historically. So we had more trucking companies and more capacity enter the market during COVID than we'd ever had before, especially pretty rapidly because of the times. Then what happened, obviously, is we started to come to a more normal state. And what's interesting, again, if you look at the data, it's not that freight volumes are crazy low right now. Freight volumes are pretty normal for history, but they are lower than in COVID periods. And so volume came down. It didn't come down drastically. It came down, it normalized. But we had all this capacity sitting out in the market because it was so great to make money during COVID. And so what's been happening now, it's supply and demand that we all learned, right? We need to have our supply normalized to get us out of this freight recession that we've been in. And FreightWaves has a great chart. It shows spot rates, and it's April 2022, and it is just a straight downward trajectory. And we've been sitting at the bottom now for quite a while. So it really is truly just the supply and demand curve that we all learned about in economics 101 playing out right in front of our very eyes.
Yeah, and if I could add something to that, Kendra, I think during COVID, there was a lot of profits made, and people said, "Oh, I'm gonna save a little bit of that for the rainy day, bank some of that." I think there was also a lot of, again, inexpensive money. They entered the market as VC money, not necessarily to trucking and brokers, but to the space in general. And then the government was sending people checks. And so it created this time that was so good that when the time came for armies to leave the field, meaning some of the carriers to leave or existing trucking companies to shed a few trucks, they were still a little flush with cash. So that bust cycle took longer to normalize.
It has, and by our calculations, it's about 2 years is what we think companies could hang on for based on the extra cash they had. So you're correct in what you're saying, right? There was a lot of ways to get cash. And if you were smart with that cash, you could stay in business a lot longer than historically because of it. And I do think that's what we're seeing.
Yep. Have we hit bottom?
It's an interesting question. Every time I say yes, I tend to be wrong. So I try to hold myself back. But from what I'm seeing, and I would say we're really close. If we have hit bottom, and what I'm saying is we're probably close to starting the upturn. If you look at freight rates, they've been really steady now, almost 9 months, and that's at the bottom. So I think we've been at the bottom. Personally, I do think we're near the end of being at the bottom, and we'll start to see things turn. But there's been some of the indicators are a little hard to look at because there's been a lot of disruption in the market, right? I think the number one thing over the summer, if you looked, freight volumes were sky high and spot rates were going up significantly. And I got excited. I was like, oh, this is the end. We're done, right? But what happened is it was really companies preparing for the port strike. So everyone was bringing in their freight early, and you can see it because the California volumes out of California were huge, right? So everyone's bringing in their freight early in case the port strike lasted a long time. And that's really what caused the uptick over the summer. So I got excited, and then it turned out it was mostly due to that. We actually saw August and September were down a little bit, and then you had the hurricanes hit. And again, you saw things start to increase again. And then we got through the election. I think people took a deep breath there as well, just because it was done. But so there's been a lot of things that are playing with the market. So it's a little hard to always make predictions based on off of the data we're seeing. But at this point, we've been clearly at the bottom for long enough to say, yes, we're at the bottom. And if you look now, the past month and a half, prime tender acceptance rates are going down. So we're starting to see a little downturn in that, which would be an early indicator. For a while, spot rates were going up. In fact, at this point, I think they're about 30 cents below contract, which is the tightest it's been in a while, in years, in about 2 years. That's another indicator. So I do think there are early indicators now, and they've been sticking around long enough that it looks like we're probably pretty close to the end of it.
I love it. I love it. I know I've heard other people say this, and there's opinions out there, of course, but I should point out that you actually are beyond opinions because you guys have this monthly,
I live it every day.
but also you guys put out this Ryder State of the Industry
We do,
report
yes.
every month in conjunction with Freight Waves. I'll make sure I put a link in the show notes. And there's an economist involved, so it's not just what your broker buddy said. This is one of the leaders in transportation, along with Freight Waves, another leader in the space, with an economist. So this is not our talk. This is
Yeah.
true.
No, I appreciate that. That's true. We spent a lot of time and effort on this. And I think the other thing that's interesting with Ryder too is because we have the truck rental and leasing side of the house as well, like that's obviously a huge component. That's also an early indicator on that side. So we're able to look at the market from a lot of lenses, which is unique to Ryder.
Yep. And one last thing while we're talking about the freight market, I was talking to my friend Jason Miller over at Michigan State, and he said typically, this is his 2 cents. And again, he's a wonk. He has his own data that he crunches through. And he said, we also would like to see some sort of external factor to help our market. So you talked about just plain and simple supply and demand. And I mentioned that to you today, and you said, Joe, it's supply and demand. Of course, we would love to see some wonderful external event. It's not a hurricane, not COVID, nothing bad, some event in the economy that. And so, what would be some of those events that would make things even accelerate a little faster?
So I struggle with this a little bit because I think there are clearly some things coming at us that are going to be short-term events, short time events. One would be there's the potential of another port strike in January, right? How does that impact freight volumes leading up to it and after? If the tariffs go into place, we could see a huge uptick of freight trying to get into the U.S. before that were to occur. So I do think there are some events that could be disruptors, but I don't think either of those would change the longer term projection, right? They're going to be short term spikes and then things normalize. I struggle to imagine what would have a really long term impact other than just the supply normalizing, to be transparent.
Yep. And again, I talk here as if I'm talking only to logistics companies and logistics providers. But if you're a shipper, this has been a really good time for the last 2 years because you've had really good companies anxious for your freight. And during COVID, they might have not returned your call. And now all of a sudden, of course, Ryder would. But now all of a sudden, everyone's, hey, please talk to us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good time to be a shipper for sure. And I have to wear both hats because I talk to shippers and carriers all day. So it is a very good time to be a shipper. But if the market tightens, those dynamics will start to change.
And that's what I wanted to talk to you about next. So let's assume we're talking just to your shipper buddies here, and we're looking at 2025. What would be your advice for, and by the way, I should also ask before we get any further, who is the sweet spot for Ryder? I know you guys work with a lot of companies. Who's the sweet spot for you guys?
On the transportation management side, our customers tend to be the size of Fortune 500 companies or Fortune 500 companies. You'll see it's usually the big names on those lists. And the reason for that, one is the service we provide is high value. So we're really going to focus on understanding your specific network. We're going to bring a lot of engineering to the table and figure out how we help you optimize that network based on your needs. Could be service, could be cost, most likely it's both. And then we're going to really manage that fully day to day for you and take that off your plate. We're also going to bring our procurement spend and strategy to the table. So with the value that we create for customers, we find the really big names get very excited about that, and they have a lot of spend at the table to optimize and gain benefit from a service like Riders. So that tends to be who our customers are, but the service is applicable across the board. If you have a lot of transportation spend, then there's more and more opportunity to optimize that and get your spend right and your service level. And that's what we're the best at.
Yep. And I think there's a lot of large companies. I talked to you about one before we hit the record button, who I think during COVID realized the importance of having an established relationship with a big player, with a significant player. Because when all of a sudden supply chain was in the news, and all of a sudden, for the first time ever, people go, "Hey, you work in supply chain. What's going on?"
My dad finally knew what I did is what happened.
Jim Tompkins, who's got to be well into his 80s, was on my podcast, and he said, I've been married, I think well over 50 years. He goes, for the first time ever, my wife said, now I get what you do. Here's an industry legend. Anyway, so assuming right now we're talking to some of the people in your sweet spot, the larger shippers, what advice would you give to them? What advice are you giving to your customers coming into 2025?
Yeah. So as I'm saying, I think the market will start to turn. I think that will not happen for a while. There's still a runway here. If you're a shipper, there's still probably at least a half a year of really low rates. I think the market will turn in 2025, but probably the latter half. So you can use the good news of that is you can use the first half of the year to get ready. And what does that mean? One is you really want to be focused on your procurement strategy, your procurement approach, how you're going to market, what's important to you as a company, because now is the time to develop that strategy and begin and execute that strategy so that you have the right carrier relationships. And for our customers, that can be a variety of things, right? Some are really pushing diversity spend and they need a diverse carrier network. And now is the time to really capitalize on that and optimize for that. For others, it's really about service, right? If the economy does really well and we're seeing consumer spending on products again, then we want to make sure that our customer services levels are exactly where they need to be to capture that market opportunity. And for others, it's cost. And you have to expect that transportation costs will here at some point start to go up. So how do you position your network to ensure that you're least impacted by that? And so that's where Ryder comes in. And what I would say to someone is who's a large company with large transportation spend is now's the time to have the right partner, right? You really want to have that right partner who has that expertise, who can bring that strategic mindset to the table and guide you based on your company's individual needs. And that's the importance of having these types of partnerships. Everyone thinks transportation is easy, but the truth is immensely complex. I think COVID brought that to light, but it's immensely complex, and having the right partner by your side really does matter.
Yep. We'll get more into why we need to partner up and get the right partner in a minute. Because I do think that I say it all the time on my podcast. It's regardless of whether you're a small shipper, a large shipper, a broker, whatever business you're in, your partners are key. And we certainly learned this during COVID, is that there was people who treated their relationships transactionally for a long time. And then during COVID, those guys don't call you back.
No, it's true. It's absolutely true, right? It's the same as the relationship with an employee, right? You want to treat your employee well and they'll treat you well. And it's the exact same relationship.
Yep. So you mentioned that some large shippers are coming to you guys and say, I want more of a diversity spend. And you guys are able to accommodate that, which is great. I know I haven't talked about it lately on my podcast, but I know a lot of these large companies still have sustainability goals. Are you hearing? I know before we hit record, Rebecca said you guys are going to an ACT Expo, and I think that's Advanced Clean Transportation Expo. So I know you guys are interested in that and working on that. Is that an ask you're getting from your large customers right now?
Absolutely. Yes. There's a lot of focus on that. I think it hasn't gone away. And in fact, right now, I think people have time and energy to spend on it because it's less chaotic for a lot of companies. So it really is key. And what Ryder's done in general is we focus on alternative energies and we have a whole team that's experts in that area That can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but even when it comes to trucking, are you talking hydrogen? Are you talking EV? What are you looking at? But we actually even have a consulting service. So we can help our customers look at what would make sense for them. Look at their, if they're thinking about EV, look at their infrastructure. Can they support it? What would it take to support it? And then we can certainly help focus on carriers who focus in that area or have specialization in that area. So it's something Ryder has put a lot of time and energy and effort into. And honestly, I would say as far as partners in the industry, we're probably the most experts in this space. So it's a really important thing for us and very important for our customers.
Yeah, and I would also say the normal blocking and tackling that you do in your brokerage and in your managed trans, which is let's avoid empty miles, let's avoid half empty trucks or a third empty truck. Somebody said to me, empty miles are killing us. And I was like, oh, yeah, no great revelation. And he goes, so are half empty miles. And I was like, oh, yeah. How many trucks are driving down the road half empty? And this is why you need a transportation provider that can do that's like a it's like a Rubik's cube. It is not easy to have a full truck.
No.
And I just before COVID, I was down in Mexico and New San Luis Potosi. And I remember they were loading a truck and I was like, and I saw all this stuff that had to go in. And I was like, oh, then somebody was asking, how should we put this in there? And I was like, oh, yeah, as soon as you look at the sizes and what can't be stacked on, it is like, it reminds me of Tetris, but much harder, like, just ridiculous. And so getting back to it, if you have a really good transportation partner, they're going to say, we're not going to be charging you for a whole bunch of empty miles. We're going to optimize this service. And when you say there's fewer empty miles, that means there's less emissions. And I know when you're working with companies like Ryder, they'll say large companies, they'll eliminate lanes. They'll say this lane's gone because we can support it this way.
I agree. And it's another one of those things I think people assume is simpler than it is. And a lot of what it is negotiating inside a shipper, meaning a lot of times business rules get created about freight, right? Meaning, hey, this has to go in intercompany transfer has to occur in this amount of time period. Or if we release this load to the warehouse, we want them to have it shipped out the door in X number of hours, right? But when you take a step back and you say, hey, what is your really high priority freight? What is the stuff that's going to a customer that has to arrive on time? Super high priority. Okay, great. Let's segment that. But what's not that high priority that if we change some of our business rules around here, we can do a much better job of optimizing the truck or changing modes to be a more efficient mode, right? Instead of going air, we're going to go ground, or instead of going LTL, we're going to go truckload or whatever it is. But it's a ton. You really have to you have to understand the customer, you have to understand their business, you have to understand their business rules and the dynamics behind those rules to really start having an impact on making those changes. And that isn't, again, it's so much easier said than done. That takes a lot of time and knowledge with that customer. And then of course, a company like Ryder, we have a large engineering team that can really come in and optimize that. But you have to have the ability to understand the business dynamics there at play.
Yep. So your advice to these shippers is you got to lock in these rates in the next quarter or two, first and second quarter of this year, because rates are going up. And I also like to talk to you a little bit about you said bid season's coming up here. So people are starting to get bids for next year's lanes. And I asked you this while we were prepping, are people doing more mini bids where they're saying, I just want to bid for this quarter? Because I like the idea of that because it seems like I can't predict a year in advance, but I might be able to predict 13 weeks in advance. So talk about what's happening with these. What we saw is mini bids, seasonal bids, annual bids. Talk about what you're seeing in the market.
Absolutely. So with our customers, Q1 is usually the biggest bid cycle by far. So annual bid cycle, vast majority of customers, that's the timing they're on. So for those who are doing that now, I think it's a great time, right? You should be able to lock in some really good rates and hold those rates. So Q1, just the way the dice are falling, I think that will be a really strong bid season for a lot of shippers and a really important bid season for a lot of shippers. To your point on the mini bids, we tend to see it come up depending on a lot of different dynamics, right? The last year has been fairly steady in rates, so less need for mini bids because of frustration out of rates, either on the shipper or carrier side. Less need for that. But where we do see it is a lot of companies are spending time now really looking at their supply chains and optimizing their supply chains, meaning where is their warehouse located, or how are they shipping freight to one of their customers? Where is it coming from? How and where is our freight moving from? And when they're making those changes, they're going to go out to a mini bid and optimize for that case. So that's what we're seeing now. I think if the market does start to change, we will start to see mini bids due to rates uptick. And they're certainly become a much more important part of the play, just even over the past few years. It didn't used to, I don't know what it does
It
now.
seems as if the technology that we have is making it easier to do those. It used to be such a disruption to do an annual bid that you didn't want to do it 4 times a year or twice a year. And it was like it shuts down the business in a way. And I think this now that we have done a better job with developing those carrier relationships and it's all in the system, it's less abusive to them too. Because when I worked for a short time at a carrier, I always remember it felt like you get bid fatigue where you're like, everybody's asking me to bid on 1,000 lanes and I get 4. Like, why do you? And then you're filling out their information and then you're like, oh my God, this is. And I remember my boss there said, don't fill out anything until they give us business. And I was like, oh my God, that was crazy. So we have to be. I think the technology is allowing us to do this a lot easier. Am I right to say that?
I think that's true. Absolutely. It's facilitating it. And I would say there's two things. So, to your point, tech, a huge component of this. And then I do think it's the emphasis that's come on supply chain since COVID. The C suite, they used to talk about supply chains that much. Now they talk about them a lot. I do think that's driving some of it as well.
Yep. So there's some other things I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about a little bit about intermodal. What's going on with intermodal in relation to trucking?
Yeah, so we are seeing volumes going up in intermodal. So if you're an intermodal provider, that's a really good sign. It's been an interesting dynamic. So if I look back at this summer, I mentioned the port strike and the impact that had on freight volumes over the summer. Most of that freight came in through West Coast ports. And what you saw was that freight, and I'm talking in generality here, but it to go onto rail. So it went intermodal, went onto rail to move across the country. One, people were bringing it in early, so they didn't need it as quickly as they would have typically done. Another is that might be how it generally moved. But we were able to take all that freight and put it into intermodal, and you still did not see a large impact or really much of an increase in rates at all, which tells you there was a lot of available capacity out there in the marketplace for rail. So that's what happened this summer. And we're seeing an increase in volume on intermodal, which was a good thing for them. But what we're still not seeing a huge impact on rates either. So there's still that capacity out there. And what I do expect, though, as we look to 25, is one of the reasons freight capacity on intermodal has been so low is because the pricing isn't that different from truckload, right? Everybody's near the rock bottom, and so if you can move it on intermodal for a similar cost to truckload, you're likely going to pick truckload. But as truckload rates go up at some point in 2025, I do think you'll see even more freight start to turn to intermodal. And so that's another thing, as you were asking earlier, hey, what should customers be thinking about? Another thing is your mode mix. It is a different mode mix now when freight is cheap in any mode versus when it does start to tighten and rates start to go up, right? And shippers have experienced that, but it's getting ready to make some of those decisions. What type of your product or what lanes can you move intermodal versus which ones do you need to keep on truckload even if the rates go up? Or where is that break-even point for you as a company? So those are some of the things we've got to start thinking about. Again, I think we have lots of time. I don't think anything's happening quickly here. I think we have time, but those are the things we do have to start thinking about.
Now, if somebody says to you, we want to we'll pay even extra, but we want cleaner and greener. Is rail and intermodal not cleaner in many cases than over the road trucking? By the way, if you're not high volume, you can't really talk about intermodal because they're not doing final mile stuff over there.
Yeah. No, I think that to your point, the actual rail part is going to be greener itself, right? The first and final mile piece is less, but yeah, I would think that'd be part of it, but it still has to fit. It still has to fit into your strategy and your
Yes, yes, it's not easy. I've advised people and even tried to get on stuff on rail before. It's not always easy. And not so long ago, I talked to my friend Martin Liu, and he's done some intermodal network type stuff. And he said, yeah, they have, the industry has traditionally not been particularly outward looking. They're not, you never talk to an intermodal salesman who says, hey, we got to move your freight over here. They know who they sell to, and it's not small volume people.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
I want to talk about lead times. You've referenced it earlier. What's the importance of lead time in our rates right now?
Right now, I wouldn't say it depends if you're looking at the shipper or the carrier. So if you're able to be flexible in your lead time as a shipper, I think you can really optimize on that right now to get some great rates out there. So we've been working with our customers to understand where they have that opportunity and take advantage of that. We've also, going back to the intermodal conversation, looked at that. Sometimes it's literally a 1 day change, right? And you can go from truck to rail. And so those are some of the conversations where lead time really does matter and does have an impact. Go
You,
ahead.
you mentioned the engineering and the tech you guys have. I think lead times are great, but a lot of times it's kind of Monday morning quarterback. Hey, had you called me on Wednesday rather than Friday, I could have saved you 30%. And they're like, thanks. Could we have that conversation before beforehand?
Well,
And I
but that's
think
when you
that's
can start to get a little predictive, right? Again, so we know our customers' habits enough. Maybe they aren't great at letting us know they're going to have the tender on Wednesday and instead they tell us Friday. But we know that they do that consistently over and over. And we can start to use that data to make different decisions on their behalf for them, with them. Those are some of the places that we can help shippers get smarter about what they're doing in their own habits. Because to your point, a lot of times the people making the decisions don't understand the impact it has down the supply chain, right? And that is I think the biggest challenge if you're a shipper is a lot of these decisions are compartmentalized, and someone making a decision here doesn't impact, it's costing a lot of money on the transportation side down the lane. And so when you can bring that insight and that visibility to a company and they can change some of the way they do things, or we can predict on their behalf and change some of the way they do things, there's huge dollars of savings there.
Yeah, and there's not only just savings, as we talk more and more about sustainability, that comes down to how do we keep the trucks full when they're on the road? And if you say, hey, we really value sustainability, tends to be company to company. But if I say I was supposed to unload here today at 6 p.m. and then rest and pick up another load down the street. But if you make that guy late and he misses that, now he's driving empty for 100 miles to another location. And again, it tends to be something that's outside of your purview. But if you have a big partner like Ryder, they're able to say, no, we got lots of backhauls for you in that area. We'll get you busy. And it's one of those things that's lost to measurement because you're like, it's not my problem. We just paid the detention. We also ruined that driver's week and we didn't help the environment any. So it's easy to say we're clean and green because it was somebody else's hassle, and the frustration for the driver, that's somebody else's hassle. I think we need to have a conversation a little bit in our industry about, could we prioritize around a driver dropping off rather than my dock likes to close at 3:30 every day?
And I think what's so interesting about that, as you're speaking, I'm thinking back to some of the interviews I did during the COVID days, right? Where people are like, why is supply chain so hard? Why can't you just get your product? And my answer was always the point you're hitting on, which is there's so many different players that are involved in getting a product from point A to point B, and they don't have the visibility to the impact they're having to each other, right? So it's dead on to your point of Hey, so because my warehouse is running a little bit behind, I make this truck sit. I think I'm paying a fee for that, and that's the extent of it. But the truth to your point is actually it creates a then series of consequences down the road,
There
right? That
there's
we actually want
externalities.
space. Yeah. And we don't as an industry have a good way of understanding that, right? And that truly is it truly is the complexity of our industry is the number of touch points and handoffs and the impact that we all have on each other and really bringing that visibility to the forefront. And I'm not going to say we've solved that one because I think that's a huge one. That's probably the challenge of the industry, but you're right. The more and more we can bring the visibility to that amongst players, the better off we'll all be.
Um, Boy, I'm looking at the time. I could talk to you all day about this, but I know you wouldn't like that. So I wanna talk to you about the impact of AI in our space. I had this conversation with you last year at Manifest. We were talking about because at Manifest, everyone's like, "AI is doing this, AI is doing that." And by the way, I'm never gonna say that's fake or that's hype because some people are doing more than others. But we were looking at it together, and I remember talking to you about it. Now here we are 10 months later. By the way, we will both be at Manifest as usual. Ryder's a big sponsor there, I know. Great event. You guys bring, I don't know, what, 50 people there?
We bring a lot. It's true. It's true. I don't know the numbers, but it's a lot of us.
It's a lot. So talk about what's going on with AI in the market.
Yeah, I there's a lot of opportunity for it in the transportation space, both in transportation management and in brokerage. And I think one of the big places we're seeing people actually implement it and not just talk is large language models. So what I mean by that is if you're calling up to a company and wanting to say, "Where's my order? Where's my truck? What's the latest status?" It's a huge opportunity there to use AI to give those answers and give them in an effective way, and then feels like you're talking to a human. The other place we're seeing it, there's a lot of articles and things out there is in brokerage, leveraging it in brokerage to actually obtain the opportunity to get freight or to find carriers. So what we tend to see is it's used as the initial entryway, AI is, and then once there's a real, I'll call it fish on the hook for probably lack of better words, then that gets handed off to a human to finish the opportunity. So it helps reduce costs, which is important in today's space, and then it allows you to still actually have a very high success rate. So I think those are the two real practical, tangible uses we're seeing happen in our space. There's a ton of things out there, but those seem to be very real that a lot of companies are grabbing onto.
Yep, yep. And I know I've had this conversation with you before about the whole idea of dirty data. If we have systems that are filled with information and we do every day we get better at having clean data, but the idea that you just say, I'm just going to use AI because all my data is good, that our data is always incomplete because we're humans and you don't have all the information necessarily.
Yes, it's tough. If you're a brand new company, you can set it up perfect from day one, you're probably in better shape.
But they don't have as much data. That's the
They don't have
problem.
much data to leverage. That's exactly right. If you're a company that has a lot of data to get smart off of with AI, you have to manage it. You
I
absolutely.
think that to make AI work, you need computing power. We all have that now. You need the algorithm so we can all come up with that. But you need good data and a lot of it. And I don't think smaller firms necessarily have it. Now they can get it from other sources, but it's not necessarily their data or their customers' data. So it's all not perfect. One other thing I want to talk to you about, cybersecurity. It's in the news. Before we hit the record button, we were talking about some of the instances. We won't mention any names, but we know some companies getting hacked. And by the way, there is no shame when big companies like AT&T get hacked, and a lot of Fortune 500 companies got hacked. In fact, United Healthcare has been in the news because of the CEO's murder. They were hacked earlier this year. I don't think it's necessarily related, but big companies with big budgets are getting hacked. It's something we all have to worry about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So what are you guys up to with that?
Yeah, it's something that Ryder has taken very seriously for a long time. We have an entire department and team focused on it. And one of the things you had asked me earlier is, hey, do you think there's a difference with smaller tech companies versus larger ones as far as cybersecurity? And one of the things Ryder does, and it's painful, but we make any company that we're going to partner with from a technology standpoint go through our cybersecurity assessment. And we've been able to find small companies that we feel very comfortable working with, which is, I think, great. It means they're really up to the standards that we require, and obviously large companies as well. And that's going to be important because technology is not leaving the space, right? You said it earlier, the VC funding coming into, and that was coming into supply chain logistics. It's obviously slowed down significantly, but there's a lot of tech development in this space, and we have to find a way to keep ourselves safe. And that's something Ryder hasn't taken their foot off the pedal on at all. And we'll continue to focus on it. I mean, it's hard when you're the middleman, when you're that person, you're representing your customers, cannot let that slide.
You work with the largest companies in the world, and you also work with the smallest companies in the world, and you guys are the middle, and you have to be the one that says these guys are safe. And I think this is why I'm not against small business. I am a small business, but small business can't invest like big business when it comes to technology. And we said it before, we always think that there's more consolidation going to happen in this business. If we have a cyber event similar to like I call the 9/11 that we had, if we have a cyber event, you could see a whole bunch of very large shippers say, who are we working with? I want to make sure we are working with somebody who meets all of our standards, whatever that is. And I do think we are going to quickly have best practices, and you are either going to meet those best practices. And those might be as simple as using one of the approved technologies. You mentioned ELD. We had, I think, 100 ELD, that's electronic logging device for anyone who's not in that. And when we required trucking companies to have an ELD, they had to be approved by the government. And I think there was only like 30 some in the beginning. I don't know how many there are now.
No, it wasn't that many. You're correct. Yep.
And it was, some people left the market rather than getting an ELD. But maybe they said, you know what, I cheat on my hours of service and I can't do that anymore. So the hell with it. I'm going to go. Truckers are talented people, so they can go do a lot of other things. But anyway, I would not be surprised to see a similar event where people go, I need to work, especially if you're Fortune 500. Can't afford to tell my boss one day, sorry, boss, we got hacked because I was working with a really small mom and they got us burned.
No, I think your point is interesting, right? There is a lot of talk of, is there going to be consolidation in the industry? We've definitely seen some, but I do think it would take a large event, and a cybersecurity one would definitely be one of those that could kick that off, right? It could create that consolidation. So there's more and more challenges every day. It's not an easy space, that is for sure.
Oh, no, we talked before we hit the record button about companies that were hacked. And again, no shame at all. I went to the cybersecurity conference down in Cleveland. NMFTA had it, and it was fascinating because everyone was very open there about this happened to us and that happened to us. And when you're hearing people, and they, by the way, they had I forgot what they were. I guess it'd be customer. It was basically a few events with no media. So I was like not invited. I'm like, am I media? Because they wanted to be able to speak frankly about what had happened to them. Some of the people shared their experiences.
That's good they were able to speak frankly, but that's hard to have.
Oh, yeah. But publicly traded companies have to disclose that we were hacked. And we all have to just, this is one more reason to partner up. And when you're looking at your technology or your technology partners or your freight brokerage partners or your managed trans partners, you better make sure they have your best interests at heart. And that means ask them those hard questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because I helped a very large company select their 3PO. We had IT requirements and all that, and I'm sure they've dealt with the cybersecurity since then, but we did not talk about cybersecurity. That was pre-COVID. It would be high on my list today of partners to work with.
Yeah, if you're managing a company's entire transportation network, absolutely, right? You absolutely have to have the right partner to do that. A partner who you can trust, who will be there and will be providing that level of service and quality that you expect. So absolutely, I agree with you.
And it's possible to make the investments that they need to make to keep upgrading the security. Anyway, enough of my blather. I want to wrap this bad boy up and get your final thoughts. I'm going to try and summarize. I'm talking to my friend Kendra Phillips. We're talking about Ryder 2025 Freight Insights. And again, check out Ryder's State of the Industry report. They make it with FreightWaves. It is top notch. I'll make sure I put a link to that in the show notes. We talked about the history where we came through. We went all the way back to ELD, which was 2017, 18, or 19, approximately.
Somewhere in there.
And then we talked about what happened during COVID. And then more importantly, what happened after COVID, where we had a boom that was unlike any other boom, but that then the bust took longer. And that's what we're needed some armies to leave the field, some trucking companies to shed some assets or some to go out of business. That's happening, unfortunately, for some companies. What is, we've hit bottom, and now if you're a shipper, this is the time to lock in rates in the first and second quarter. If you're a provider, you're looking second, third quarter of next year. Hopefully, things will be better rates. And your advice to large shippers is cost increases are coming. Lock in that first and second quarter. Also, talk to people who can help you get intermodal, and it's maybe cheaper, certainly greener, and companies like Ryder can help you there. Always lead time. You can save some money and make life easier for your providers if you work on the lead time. We talked about AI and how you guys are using it and how you see the future for it. But right now, a lot of it is large language learning models and cleaning up all of our legacy dirty data. I don't know. That's been happening over time anyway, but I think really AI can't be what it needs
To be successful, yeah, you have to have it.
to
I
clean it
agree.
all up. And then we talked about cybersecurity. You have to pick a partner that can make those investments in cybersecurity. Make sure your tech guys have you covered. Last but not least, all these reasons are why you need to pick a really good freight partner, someone like Ryder. Put a big old bow on this, Kendra.
Absolutely, Joe. Thank you for the time. I think you summarized it perfectly. But what I would really say is if you're a shipper, it's been a good market the past couple of years, right? I do think we'll see that change start to happen in 2025. I don't think it will happen rapidly. So I think everyone has time to prepare. But as you said, having the right partner, not just for costs, but for strategy and for optimization is extremely important. And we do hope you consider Ryder when making that decision. So thank you.
Yep. So I know I wrote down some of the conferences I'll see you guys at. You'll be at Manifest, which is in February. I sat in the Ryder, you guys, the VIP seats for the
conference.
for Neo, and the year before it was Nelly.
No.
Anyway, I know you guys will also be at this conference called ACT Expo. I think that's Advanced Clean Transportation Expo. And I wrote down this NPTC.
National Private Truck Conference.
And I know you guys are at every conference I go to. So I know if you're looking for Ryder, you will find Ryder. I will make sure I put a link to your LinkedIn profile, link to your website, and any of the links you and the marketing team give me, I'll put in the show notes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Kendra, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I could talk to you all day about these topics.
I love it. Thank you, Joe. It was wonderful. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Excellent. And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support is very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.